Great. Thanks so much, Steve. Very often in the industry, I'm focused on talking about like specific technologies, topics around virtual design and construction, topics around data integration, data analytics. Today, I'm going to just like zoom out, take a step back, and talk big picture. It's pretty exciting, I think, some of what comes out of the AEC Hackathon, and it's why I've been excited to be a part of it for so many years now. But when we think about innovation and when we think about bringing new tools, new technologies to the industry, we really need to start thinking about not what we can do, but what we should do, right? And not just about what's possible, but about, hey, what really targets our customers' needs and problems, right? What are we doing that's adding value to the world that we live in? So that's kind of the perspective I'm going to take today. I hope it'll just be like a fun conversation and give you sort of a framework to think about as everybody's going through their hacking solutions over the next last few days of this hackathon. So before we really dive in, I just wanted to share a little bit about myself and about VIATechnik. Really quickly, just to give you the perspective that I'm coming from. So as Steve mentions, I'm the founder and CEO of VIATechnik. I founded the company about 8 years ago, originally from a background in civil engineering and general contracting. I worked in Sydney, Australia, Silicon Valley, and Chicago on both the building and infrastructure side of the construction industry, and just started feeling a little bit overwhelmed by the lack of technology adoption that I was seeing within the industry, while at the same time the world around us was evolving so quickly. So 8 years ago, my husband and I founded VIATechnik with the goal of digitizing the design, construction, and operations of buildings and infrastructure, because we feel like through that digitization, a lot of power is unlocked. We can now understand the built environment, and from that understanding comes a lot of really great innovation and action. Outside of my role at VIATechnik, I sit on the board of directors of two really interesting companies. One is called Ryan Companies US, ENR Top 50 company. They're a real estate developer, construction and design firm, so really integrate across those perspectives. And then I also sit on the board of JF Brennan, which is a 100-year-old heavy civil infrastructure and marine construction company headquartered in Wisconsin. A little bit about VIATechnik. As I mentioned, we founded the company to transform the built environment through that digitization of design, construction, and operations, and we do that in 3 different ways. So the first is in an advisory or consulting capacity, where we try to really understand what are our clients' corporate strategies and how does a digital strategy align with that. We understand that we can only have so great of an effect when we're only focused on a consulting capacity, when we're like, hey, here's your strategy, like, good luck. So more often than not, we're engaged in some level of implementation and development. So actually creating the 3D models, creating custom tools for our clients, things like that. And then the last is through education. And so typically, historically, that had been a lot of custom training for our clients. Once we've set that corporate strategy and we've got some of this technology in motion, you start realizing, hey, there's a skills gap. How do we start filling that? But we've also formalized our education initiatives with a partnership with Stanford University and their Center for Professional Development and Center for Integrated Facilities Engineering, Stanford SIFE, to co-deliver the virtual design and construction certificate course. So we're very excited about that. So with that, let's kick it off. So why are we talking today? I mentioned that there's a lot that we can do, but we really need to start focusing on what we should do. Throughout the history of construction, and especially lately, there's been a lot of momentum with new technology, right? Our job sites, we're wearing augmented reality goggles, we're flying drones, there's virtual reality, there's all sorts of virtual simulation tools, there's a whole world of like data analytics, data integration, dashboarding, machine learning, AI, right? All those buzzwords that we hear are popping up, and people, I think, are really excited. But we want to make sure that we don't get caught up in what we can do and really understand what we should do. What we should do is grounded in what problems we're actually solving and what our clients actually need. So to start reframing our mind and thinking about problem-focused or customer-centric innovation, I like to use an approach called design thinking. I believe it was originally created as a framework for the Stanford D School, the design school at Stanford. And there's a 5-step approach: empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. I draw this in a very linear fashion, but please understand that it's iterative, right? As we test, we're feeding ideas back in, and what we're learning, right, might bring us back to that empathize phase, might bring us back to that ideate phase. And for sure, prototype and testing is this constant evolution. So while I showed it in this linear fashion, please understand that it's sort of never ending, and we're always improving, and we should always be innovating, and this is somewhat circular. So let's dig into each of these 5 steps of the design thinking approach. So the first step is empathize. This is where we should start to understand our customers' viewpoints. And I think the word empathize is really interesting because it speaks to more than just what they're saying, right? We can go to a customer and ask them, what do they want? What does their day look like? But we really need to uncover the emotions behind that, not just understand what they're saying, but why they're saying it. And maybe some of the emotions that are behind that don't even lead to anything that they say, right? It's maybe still uncovered. So we do this empathy through interviewing, through what I call day in the life, sort of shadowing our clients, right? Just put yourselves into their shoes and understand what their day looks like. What problems are they faced every minute, right? What goals do they have, both personally and professionally, within that role, within that company, and as a person. And like I said, really uncover that emotion. I think that that's something that our industry sometimes forgets, but I actually think is a very important part of this problem-focused, customer-centric innovation thinking. So the next step after we've sort of empathized with our customers is this defining phase. So we want to now say, here's what we've heard. Here's the problem that I'm starting to uncover. And I try to break it into 2 buckets. First, understanding goals and objectives. And this, I think, sometimes has like a positive view. It's that art of the possible, right? Aspirationally, what do they want? In 5 years, what should their company look like? Their ideal day isn't happening today. What should their ideal day look like? And then it's also those problems and pain points. Trying to understand, hey, if we solve for X, Y, and Z, how do we make their lives better? So that's the define phase, which leads us to the ideate phase. So we now understand our clients, we understand what they're looking for. Now it's time to brainstorm, and we're trying to look at that art of the possible, right? What are the range of all the possible solutions? And I think this is a phase where sometimes people get really caught up. I hear a lot of people say, I'm not really creative, or I'm not like the ideas person, I can execute. And I actually think that there's a lot of ways almost any of us could become those creative ideas people. So there's a couple things that I try to think about. The first is the yes and approach. So many of you may have heard this through, what do you call it? The improv. And so in improv, when somebody throws something out on stage, you're never supposed to say no. You're always supposed to just go with it. So the typical response, right? A rhino just barged through my office. Yes, and what is it doing here? We have to run. And so just kind of like going with the flow, I think really helps open up that creative juices. You've never said no, so you're not shutting any idea down. Just try not to judge those ideas coming out. And try not to judge them before they come out. That's sort of the worst, right? It needs to get out into that room with the other people that you're ideating with. And sometimes I think the best way to do this is to say, hey, we're not looking for the best idea, we're looking for the worst idea. And that becomes sort of silly, right? And it can be sort of fun to think of the worst way to solve somebody's problem. But what that means is you've entered into a realm where you're not afraid to say something. And I think that ideation phase is very powerful. So any little thing that we can do to allow ourselves to come up with those really interesting solutions, we should definitely try them. So after the ideation phase, it's about prototyping. I say that it's time to get real. So we need to build a mock-up or a small small part of the solution so that we can actually show, not tell, right? And get that mock-up in front of the customer. I think the prototyping phase is important for a couple of reasons. One, we do not want to build something that at the end of the day, the customer is like, hey, you totally misunderstood what I was talking about here. You gave me X, I was looking for Y, right? You gave me an apple, I was looking for an orange. So that's one thing, right? We don't want to get too far. And why don't we want to get too far? Well, we have limited resources here, right? You have limited time, you have limited money. Even if you're going after tons of VC funding, there's still a limit to it. So we want to think about how do we prototype in a smart way that allows us to create those tests, understand if it actually is hitting at the problem that we defined, and learn from there. So prototyping leads to testing. Incredibly important. Testing is all about feedback. 2 questions: what's working, what's not working? It's okay to fail, and you actually should fail. If you haven't experienced some failure in this prototype testing loop, it means you didn't try hard enough. It means you didn't step outside your comfort zone enough. It means you were playing it a little bit too safe, I think. So failure is not only okay, it's necessary. So this is the design thinking approach, and I hope that this is a framework. I mean, if there's like one slide to take a snapshot of, it's this. And I hope that this is a framework that you can bring to your hacking experiences to make sure that you're not just building something super cool that has this wow factor, but that it actually speaks to a customer need.
Hey, Danielle.
Yes.
As I have a question of my own, actually. It doesn't even come from the audience, but you know, one of the things in our industry that I think that we kind of all stumble over is that word customer, because we have internal customers, we have external customers, we have somebody that you know, if I'm a subcontractor, the general contractor is my customer. If I'm an architect, you know, or if an engineer, sometimes the architect may be my customer. And then, but ultimately, there's always the owner and operator. That to me is who's writing the checks all the way through. But
Yes.
what I'm hearing you say really applies across all of those. Is that fair?
It does. Yeah, it does apply across all of those. You bring up an incredibly interesting point, Stephen. And I actually, very often when we're thinking about how to propose solutions to our customers, we map some of that, right?
Yeah.
So who is the user, right? They need a very clean experience. They're the ones who are like out there feeling the problem that your solution solves. But the user is thinking very differently about the solution than the like economic buyer, right? Or the decision maker. And so, okay, you might have created like a really sleek mobile app. The project engineer is your user. They love it. They want it in the field. The fact of the matter is that we did not define the business case for the CEO. The CEO is writing the check, right? And you know, our industry is even more complex because I just gave you an example with project engineer and CEO, let's say of a construction company, but now we have other stakeholders that are interacting with that construction company, designers, engineers, trade contractors, and then we have the construction company's client, which is the owner, right? So what problem did the owner solve? Did the CEO actually, are they going to say, yes, we're writing that check, or is that something that's getting passed along to the owner? So incredibly important point, Steve. This is a pretty like simplified framework. And so then there's this opportunity to dig in, and there's a lot of stakeholders here that are important to start mapping out what they care about.
Yeah, it just struck me. It's really strong. I like the clarity of what you're saying, but I do believe it applies across a lot of them. I just want to see if I was picking up on your message correctly.
Yeah, no, it's a perfect part of the message. Where we sit at VIATechnik, we see a lot of, I mean, it's not just the own innovative ideas that we have that we're bringing to our clients. We see a lot of the like startup software, hardware, technology ecosystem. And it's actually pretty common that I see a disconnect between who's going to pay for something and who's going to benefit from something. One quick example that I have is there's a realm of companies that are sort of opening up around streamlined construction closeout, right? We have this problem that like the project's ending, we need to collect all that documentation, collect all of the models, collect all of the site photography, and turn it over to the owner. Well, at the end of the day, the owner benefits from it. But they're trying to sell to the general contractors because they're the ones that lead it. But when you look at the general contractors, they're pushing so much of that to first staff within their company who very little have the decision-making buying power, and two, their trade contractors. So you have this like distributed value proposition. It's really hard to figure out what, even though you've come up with a good solution, it's really hard to figure out like how to actually sell that. So that's a great point.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Now,
So when,
now that
no, this was like perfect.
Go ahead.
This was perfect. This was perfect. So another framework, and it's kind of like a funny framework, I think, that I keep in the back of my mind when thinking about solving problems is what kind of problem solver, or I'll call it painkiller, are you? I have 3 pictures here. They are all, to some extent, solving pain. I have vitamins, I have Tylenol, and I have morphine. So vitamins are the cheapest, they're readily available, you can get it anywhere, they're not expensive, I guess, unless you're going for some of the fancy vitamins. But they're sort of like a nice to have. You will survive without them. They're one of those things that maybe you should take it every day, and if you take it every day, you'll feel healthy, but like in the moment, you don't necessarily feel like it's solved any problems. Second is Tylenol. If I have a really bad headache, I've had a stressful day, meeting after meeting after meeting, it's 2 p.m. and I have this headache I can't shake, I can't get through the day without some sort of painkiller like this. So I felt the problem, it came to the solution, and it's something that in the moment I need. Then there's morphine. So it's similar to Tylenol in that you felt the pain and you needed that solution. But the thing about morphine versus a Tylenol is that it's addictive and potentially in a bad way, right? But what I'm trying to say is once you've solved the problem with the morphine, you need that morphine, and it's going to be very hard for you to get away from that morphine. So when we're thinking, whether it's something that we're doing internally at VIATechnik or whether it's a technology that we're recommending, sort of keeping in the back of my mind, hey, is this a vitamin, which is like nice to have, but you could live without it, and there are definitely days you forget to take your vitamin. Is it a Tylenol? So it's getting at a pain, but it's not gonna like solve the biggest pain that you have, and you probably could survive without it. Or is it morphine, and it's very specifically solving that pain, and it's so good, it's addictive. So think about that as well as you're coming up with your solutions. And I suggest that you think, right? Here's the solution we came up with. Is it a vitamin? Is it Tylenol? Is it morphine? Or is it none of these? In which case, hey, we might need to tweak this because it's not solving any pain. So I want to shift gears a little bit and think not just about this like innovation problem solving realm, but start to think about entrepreneurship. So now we have this interesting innovation and created something at this hackathon, and hey, you want to see if this has legs. You want to see if there's this entrepreneurial aspect that you could pursue. And there's just one thing I wanted to share about entrepreneurship that I thought was very interesting. A lot of people view entrepreneurs as bold risk takers. Malcolm Gladwell here reframes it and says, successful entrepreneurs are seen as bold gamblers, but in reality, they're highly risk averse. There's a very, very good article by Malcolm Gladwell called The Sure Thing. If anybody emails me afterwards, I'd be glad to share it with you. But you can just Google Malcolm Gladwell, The Sure Thing. And he reframes entrepreneurship not as this bold risk-taking mentality, but actually as a way of taking calculated bets, or what he calls the sure thing, right? And the entrepreneurs are more likely to capitalize quickly on that sure thing than other people. And why are they able to capitalize on that sure thing? Why were they able to feel that it's the sure thing? Because they tested and they iterated, right? They saw, hey, is this going to work? Let's put something out there. Let's see if it aligned with the client. If it didn't work, let's pivot quickly. They're taking these calculated small risks. They're never taking that big risk because they've built that design thinking process that I showed before has showed them if something's going to work or not work. So Malcolm Gladwell says that actually entrepreneurs are not bold gamblers. They're predators. As an entrepreneur myself, I thought that this was pretty weird, and is definitely never like a word I would have used to describe myself. But I started thinking about what does he mean, and actually it's interesting, right? If you look at a predator, here I have a female lion hunting. You probably think that they're brave, right? They're risk takers. But if I picture that lion and what it's about to hunt down, it's never the elephant, the rhino, the alligator. It's definitely the gazelle, right? And which gazelle is it? It's not the strongest and the fastest, it's the weak one. So in reality, they didn't actually take a risk. They took that calculated bet on what they thought was the sure thing. So that might be something to also kind of like reframe your mind as you're thinking through how to personally spur innovation in the industry. How can you create a series of tests to know if you're headed into a sure thing or not? So now I've talked a lot about like what you should be thinking about, how we should be reframing our innovative mindset to solve our customers' problems. Let's actually just quickly go through some of the problems that our construction industry is facing today. My belief is that you can target micro problems. Hey, there's this problem that project engineer is facing on the construction site, or you can tackle macro problems. If we start to, at least in the back of our mind, keep an eye towards those macro problems, that's where we're going to actually start to see change in the industry, right? So it's not just one technology that hit the job site, but it's about moving the industry forward. So what are some of the macro trends that we should keep in mind when thinking about how to move the industry forward? The first that I'd like to share, the UN by 2050 projects that 68% of our population will live in urban areas, which means that there is an incredible need for us to build urban cities better, faster, smarter. With that growth of urban cities is an intense need for infrastructure. It's something that around the world, we're feeling that demand for infrastructure. From where I sit within the United States, we're struggling. And year after year, the American Society of Civil Engineers rates our infrastructure failing score. So their most recent report rates America's infrastructure a D+. So I don't care like what your grading scale is, that's not good. So that's a problem that we have and that we need to start to think about how to solve. I firmly believe that the biggest challenge facing not just the construction industry, but humanity today is climate change. And it's one of those changes that, and one of those problems that because it's slow, is so easy to put off into the back burner. But with where we sit in the construction industry, we have such a great impact. First, on how to build resilient environments that take into account the climate change that's happening, and two, to minimize that climate change impact. Construction accounts for 40% of the world's waste. Imagine the impact we could have if we started to think about how to build our projects differently and reduce that impact. So this is a really interesting image. It's put out by The Economist. I believe it was in late 2019. And they took, actually, I think it was early 2020. Sorry for that. But The Economist started in 1843. And they drew a bar from the year 1843 to today. If it was 1 degree higher than the average in that time span, they drew it as red. If it was 1 degree or more lower than the average temperature in that time span, they drew it as blue. So the darker the blue, the lower below average. The darker the red, the higher above average. This image, while beautiful, shows very, very clearly that the world is heating up. I think it's a very powerful image to describe the climate change story, and I believe that construction is one of the few industries that can have an immediate impact on how our world responds. This is a chart you've probably seen before. Potentially, you've even seen it in another AEC hackathon. But I just described these macro trends, and here's the problem that the construction industry is facing, and that's a productivity problem. I'm going to focus on the United States since that's where I live, but I like to show this chart because it shows every country and their productivity growth versus themselves. So actually some countries are improving in productivity. The farther to the right, the more you're growing in productivity. The farther to the left means you're declining in productivity. On the y-axis, we see cost of labor productivity. So the US is in the upper left quadrant, which means we have a high cost of labor and we have declining productivity, which means that declining productivity has a greater economic impact because of the cost of labor that's experiencing that productivity decline.
Can I ask, can I interject something, or actually almost a challenge?
Yeah, sure.
A discussion point. So exactly on this, I was in a call this week with I'm part of the Digital Twin Consortium, and we're developing that group. But and this comes up a lot of times in a lot of my talks. Even we've been disrupting, if you will, this industry for decades, and I think a lot of people still consider emailing a PDF of a drawing a disruptive perspective.
Yeah.
And at the risk of sounding onerous here, but this is my personal aspect and perspective. We don't have time to disrupt anymore. We have to replace. We have to stop and actually replace. And in the U.S., we have a lot of problems. I keep hearing, okay, well, the contractual and the liability and the design, and we have to incrementally go about it. But I believe that we're going to have a few portions of it. For instance, I'm going to use an analogy of Uber. There were taxis everywhere, and especially in the U.S., we often don't have the infrastructure of public transportation. A lot of other countries do. Uber came in and they figured it out, and they kind of won. Now, we can argue about all the controversy of Uber or not, but then it also spawned not just Uber, but then Lyft. And I mean, there's Grab, there's these same business models all over because somebody figured it out and it worked. I think, I really feel that that's going to be what is that change, Danielle, that helps us get to, it's going to be that complete replacement of this linear process of an owner and requirements and design and engineering. And, I think that's going to congeal more. What's your, I mean, maybe I'm totally crazy.
Yeah. So it's interesting, right? There's incremental change, and then there's game changing, right? Yeah. Start from something completely different rather than taking what's known and incrementally improving it or changing it. I do hope that our industry sees this disruptive change. But there's a lot of complexities within our industry that I think make it pretty different than like an Airbnb for construction or an Uber for construction. And I think part of the complexities is that there are many different stakeholders that only some of which are within our control. And the impact that peer disruption saying, hey, like Uber took an approach, hey, we don't care about the agencies that aren't within our control. We're just going to make the city mad, and then they're going to deal with it, and then they're going to talk to us, and we're going to like change policy. That's a little bit harder to do when you have lives on the line. And so it's one thing when you're talking about like driving from your home to dinner. It's another thing when you're dealing with an industry like construction or manufacturing or healthcare, where you do have safety and quality of life on the line. So I do think that our industry and people coming in to try to disrupt the industry and people within the industry trying to disrupt it need to like really understand the complexities from a people, process, and technology standpoint. And kind of what I say is you need to understand the game you're playing in order to change the game. And I do see people entering the construction industry thinking, hey, I'm from manufacturing, like I can go do this, or hey, I used to do supply chain here, I'm going to go disrupt construction. And it takes a while, I think, to learn the complexities of the industry. And then, hey, I welcome those opportunities. I hope that our industry sees disruption. I think that the disruption is going to come through collaboration and integration of various technologies. And that's why I think, you know, the relationships we build in this industry and the partnerships between different companies is so vital to moving the needle. Because yeah, I really want to stop showing this slide because I want all the countries to go be on the right-hand side of this. And then for us to say that, hey, actually, we've started catching up to manufacturing productivity growth.
Yeah, well, one thing we do have now, though, that I've seen that is kind of where I think at the bottom of that hockey stick blade of adoption, and that is that now this day-to-day decision makers, even middle managers, have never gone to work a day in their life without the internet in their pocket, and that is really kind of replaces our foundational thought processes versus paper, you know, a spec book and a roll of plans. You know, the people that start out with that, it's been a little, now there's a lot of people in the industry that never even had that experience. So yeah, that's, I think, helpful for us and going to pick up and accelerate some of this.
You know, and I think like what we're seeing today showed that like a lot of this technology deployment was much more possible than we thought.
Yeah.
You know, I think I'll skip ahead and then I'll go back one because I think it's relevant. So COVID-19 hits and I feel like our entire world changes. Yeah. So our team at VIATechnik spent about 2 months interviewing designers, construction firms, real estate developers, and owners to understand how COVID was impacting their business, part of which started to focus on how was technology changing in response, right? And we published this about a month ago. We started interviewing people in like April, so very, very early on. And the situation here is still evolving. So like these charts will change, but this is what we captured in the first 2 months. First, we started asking, how likely are you to survive this COVID pandemic? And the good news was, by and large, people felt like they had a moderately likely or very high likelihood of survival. However, we said, hey, should a second wave hit, and I guess what we didn't anticipate was that this first wave was not going to leave for a very long time. How likely are you to survive? More likely than you said before, less likely, or same likelihood? 30% said that they were less likely to survive if a second wave hit. You know, now I would ask, right, if this lasts for 6 months, 1 year, 1.5 years, right, how likely are you to survive? So there's this intense pressure. What's interesting about this pressure is that companies can no longer be complacent. Status quo is not fine. Something completely shook it up. And that's a vital component to change, is that pressure to change. So then we started asking them, hey, what are you seeing in terms of your digital design and construction tools? 52%, 51.9% said that already, and again, remember that I started talking to these people in April, 52% were saying that they were already starting to see more tools. A couple companies gave us examples. We had an 18-month rollout. So one company's real example was we had an 18-month rollout of a cloud-based BIM platform. We did it in a week and a half. Because they had to, because all of a sudden everybody was working from home and there was no big room on the job site trailer. So it's not just that your own company was working from home, but every stakeholder you were collaborating with was working remotely. So there was no like, let's figure this out in 18 months. It's like, do it today or your project's going to suffer. So to say that, hey, an 18-month planned rollout that was planned by the executive and IT team happened in a week and a half showed me that when we want to do it, we can do it. Yeah. And so again, I think it's going to go back to integration of different solutions and collaboration between different players in the industry. That's where I'm really excited.
Yeah, you know, and something that I believe, and really even with the AEC Hackathon community, you know, in the 7 years, what you just said, you never mentioned that somebody created a new tool, a new way of doing something. These tools have always, or have been there for a long time. You know, Zoom that we're using right now, this is not new. When we had the first board meeting, it was a free device that we used for AEC Hackathon all over the world. And that was years ago. And now it's almost ubiquitous today, but there's the same thing with a lot of the BIM platforms, a lot of the platforms, once we had to use them, they were already there. Nobody's developed new technologies in the past 2, 3, 4 months. I don't believe. They've been adapting their processes to leverage that technology because they had to.
Absolutely. So I very often share with people our framework of people, process, and technology. And I say that the technology sort of the easy side, because really it just takes like resources, right? Mm-hmm. There's enough money, enough time, and you buy the software, you buy the hardware. Like technology we can probably deal with. Most of the innovation our industry sees, even if it is new to our industry, was likely used in another industry. Very often our team at VIATechnik is starting to think about, hey, what are we seeing in gaming and entertainment and healthcare and manufacturing, and how can we bring that here in a new way? Yeah. But it's tried and tested somewhere else. So the technology, I think, is the easiest piece of this people, process, and technology. But then process is about, hey, what processes do you already have in place that need to change? What processes just need to be completely revamped? And people is pretty interesting, right? It's back to those people's goals and objectives, problems and pain points. It's who's the change champions and who's resisting, and why are they resisting? You should listen to them because they probably have really good reasons. And that means we should tweak our approach. And then what are their skill sets? Both soft skills and hard skills, right? It's not just the technology, hey, I need to learn how to use this software, but it's managerial skill sets and it's soft skill sets. So it's that people, process, and technology that I think is going to move us forward.
Great. Fascinating study. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah. So as we wrap up here, and to just kind of draw it to a close, I've tried to bring you through, hey, what are some frameworks for design thinking and how we tackle problems and focus on customers? What are some of the big problems that we're facing? And now how can we start to think about deploying these new solutions? You have two options, I think, when deploying an innovative solution. You can either be better, faster, or cheaper than the current solutions. It takes truly disruptive innovation to be all three of those. I think the typical sort of saying is that you can only be two. I don't think that that's necessarily true. If you kind of like create this new space, I think you can be better, faster, and cheaper than the existing solutions. Or have you created a solution that's a brave new world, something completely different? That's where very often we see this like disruptive technology, right? Amazon created for themselves a brave new world. And at this point, it's hard to think about anybody who's going to come in and disrupt them because they blazed that territory. If you're in a brave new world scenario, I want you to ask yourself two questions, which I try to ask myself, and my husband and I would chat about this when we were thinking about starting VIATechnik. Two questions you should ask yourself is, why did no one else do this before? Sounds like a very basic question, but when you ask yourself this question, you might find out, hey, somebody else did do this before and it failed because of X, Y, and Z. Or you might say, nobody else did this before because it's a really bad idea and we just shouldn't do it. Or you might say, hey, nobody else did this before because of this. This is what we know now. You know, the environment's changed. A new technology has opened up. Nobody else put X, Y, and Z together. All right. So then you have a good justification why nobody else did this before. But just make sure that you're not embarking on mistakes that already happened or just a really bad idea. And then the second question you should ask yourself is, why or how can I do this better than anybody else? And this is your unique value proposition, I think, when spurring innovation. How do you know if you're doing it better than anybody else, if your solution is actually working? And that's the money. So what's pretty interesting is I do see a lot of startups, and they're doing market surveys, they're doing customer research, they're bringing customers together and doing roundtables, and they're hearing a lot of great feedback. They're hearing customers say, hey, if you did this, I would use it. The only way to know if any of that is true is if they're willing to give you money. And somebody once told us that making money shouldn't be that hard. If it is, you're doing something wrong. So this for me is sort of the best way to test, right? Do you actually have a paying customer? If you do, it means you've solved that problem. It means to some extent you're a vitamin, a painkiller, or Tylenol or morphine. So that's all I wanted to go through today. If you guys have any questions, you know, after the presentation, or if you want that Malcolm Gladwell article that I referenced, let me know, and I'd be happy to share it with you. You can email me at engineers@viatechnik.com.